Hello, I'm Pastor Dave, and this is our 7th session in our Bible study on the book of Acts. Now, in this session, we're looking at Acts chapters 21 through 24. And in these 4 chapters, which sounds like a lot, but will probably be less than what we've done in previous weeks, we're starting to wrap up Acts with Paul's return to Jerusalem and then his journey to Rome. And this will encompass all of this week and next week. Now, in Acts chapter 21, Paul has returned to Jerusalem. And along the way, there were some questions. He visited people along the way, and a lot of them were actually worried about him. They were concerned what would happen to him in Jerusalem. Jerusalem having this reputation as a place where prophets are killed. And there are some who accompany him, but primarily he's visiting these places he's already been, like Tyre, Ptolemais, and Caesarea. Places where he has already been there, and they welcome him with open arms. But Paul is determined to continue on regardless of the threat. And this really is what we get in the first 16 verses of chapter 21. It's just his travel itinerary back to Jerusalem. And really, when we look at this, there are a few things to keep in mind. One is the word carriage comes up in here. That really means baggage, depending on what version of the Bible you have. But the big thing I would like to point out here is the practices of Christian hospitality that are already on display. Because this is why this section is important. The itinerary doesn't matter. But here, the full fellowship is on display, and we see this in the hospitality, where he is welcomed in to the homes of the disciples, and it shows us what hospitality is. It's welcoming in the stranger, and it involves a welcoming and a sharing of resources at its core basis. And this is required of all Christian leaders, as Paul wrote to Titus in Titus 1:8, and also of all Christians, as Paul wrote to the Romans in Romans 12, verse 13. Well, we also see 3 other parts of Christian fellowship here, and that is the affection for one another. It's physical, it's visible, it's not just something in one's heart, but can be witnessed by other people. We also see it in the fellowship in their prayer together, and praying together, and also in discussing the important decisions together. The discernment of God's will is never done privately, it's done corporately, it's done together. And this is even seen in Paul being adamant he's going to Jerusalem, but they still discuss it with each other. Now, in verse 17 is when we get into Jerusalem, where Paul is meeting with the brothers of the church and with James and all the elders. And this is the main focus of the sermon we've had this week, of the importance of reporting in and what that does and how it helps clarify things. And that's really what this reporting in is. That they're kind of affirming the work that Paul has already done. But they're also asking for clarification, because there were some reports that kind of made it seem like Paul was doing things that maybe he shouldn't have done, and what that meant, and they were looking at all those things. And we get some of that here where they ask clarifying questions. And they come to a resolution because there was some tension here, mainly over whether Paul was telling all Christians that they could avoid or not do the Jewish customs, or was he just telling the Gentiles that, and the Jewish Christians could still do their customs? And overall, when we see this here, we get clarification. And part of this comes to a resolution that James kind of presses onto Paul, and that's the Nazirite vow, as just a means of showing, or for Paul to demonstrate that he's still Jewish, he still holds these things as important. And this is a big deal. When we look at the Nazirite vow, I mean, this is something that takes time. It involves the shaving of one's head, but then letting your hair grow for 30 days while you abstain from eating meat and consuming wine. And at the end, there were a series of sacrifices that needed to be made, like the sacrifice of a 1-year-old lamb as a sin offering, a ram as a peace offering, a basket of unleavened bread, cakes of flour mixed with oil, and also a meat offering and a drink offering. This was not cheap. And the whole point of this was Paul saying, yes, some of these things are still important. And really, for us, the big thing to look at is one of the concerns that James had, and that was over not trying to draw the Jews away from their faith in God. And really, this focused heavily on the moral law found in the law of Moses. And this is a debate we still have of kind of the three types of law of the law of Moses. There's a civil law, there's a ceremonial law, and there's a moral law. And we can look here in chapter 21 and really see that James is concerned not on the teachings on salvation or anything else. It's keeping the moral law still as part of the church. And a reminder that a regenerative people should still pursue holiness. And we see that heavily when you look at verse 25. This is important for them. And really, if we want to boil this down, we can look at this, the idea that Paul is affirming that Christ ended the law of Moses. We see him say this in Romans chapter 10, verse 4. But he did not insist on Jewish Christians giving up their customs. And this may seem silly, but this is something we deal with all the time, in the same vein of, in churches, we do certain things at certain times in certain ways. They become kind of the local custom. And it does always cause tension when someone seeks to change those customs. But overall, this is a positive meeting for Paul. There's the issue is addressed, but they're also affirming what he has done. There's no jealousy in this. It's just reporting in on ministry as they prepare to move ahead. But everything changes, and this is kind of one of those transition points in the book of Acts, where now it's fully towards the journey to Rome. Because in verse 27, Paul goes to the temple. At this point, there are people from all over the world going to the temple. And that included Jews from Asia Minor. And in the study of this, it's likely Ephesus. That they recognize who Paul is, and they immediately start basically causing problems. And this goes about because of a man, Trophimus, who was a Gentile from Ephesus who had been seen with Paul. Now, Paul was at the temple because of the Nazarene vow. And the rumor was that this man, Trophimus, was actually with him and went into the temple where he should not have gone. Because in the temple complex itself, there was the courtyard of the Gentiles where anyone could go in. But between the court of the Gentiles and the court of women, there was actually a sign. And this is what the sign said, at least according to William Barclay. No man of alien race is to enter within the balustrade and fence that goes around the temple. And if anyone is taken in the act, let him know that he has himself to blame for the penalty of death that follows. Basically a warning saying, if you're not Jewish, go no further. If you do, it's on you. And this was taken so seriously, even the Romans let the Jews enforce this. They normally wouldn't let people kind of do capital offenses on their own. This was the one they let go. And for them, they assumed that Paul took a Gentile with him into this because the man had been seen with Paul in Jerusalem. He had traveled with him. And this basically causes a riot. They basically want the mob around the temple wants Paul lynched. At this point, the Roman commander just looks around and goes, oh no, and immediately arrests Paul, puts him in chains, which as a Roman citizen, he should not be bound, but they didn't know who he was yet. And they get him out of there. Meanwhile, starting in verse 37, Paul wants to talk, which of course Paul does. And he asks the tribune, who was Lysias, and asks if he could speak. And part of it was they were worried about who he was. They asked if he knew Greek, because that was the language most people knew. But they also thought he was an Egyptian assassin who had caused some disturbance recently, so they were very cautious about this. But ultimately, then Paul says who he is, that he's a Jew, he's from Tarsus, and he is a citizen, and asks to speak, at which point he's given permission to speak, and he speaks in Hebrew. And that declaration that he's a citizen is important, because that means he's not a rabble-rouser. He's not the Egyptian, and he's someone who had just been bound even though he was a citizen. And this is where chapter 22 picks up, and this is Paul speaking. And really, in the first 21 verses break down into what Paul is saying. And really, it gets down to Paul's description as a zealous Jew, his encounter with Jesus, Ananias and his help, and Paul's vision in the temple. A lot of this goes to the fact that every part of this has a purpose. When declaring himself that he's a Jew, he wanted them to know that that's who he is. But he also wants them to know the facts of his conversion. And this also helps to place him with the people, that they now know who he is. If he's still a Jew, he's a man from Tarsus. And even the words he's using, brothers and fathers, it establishes a Jewish heritage. He's speaking in Hebrew, which does the same thing, because a non-Jew would not really know Hebrew. They would be speaking Aramaic or Greek. And he points out that even some of the Jewish officials know who he is. They knew what he had done for them. But then he speaks of his encounter with Jesus, which is a retelling of what happens in Acts 9. And then how that plays out as well, that he wasn't some renegade. I mean, he was entrusted by the high priest Ananias to go do this action. And that was meant to kind of turn the people's attitude that this man isn't an enemy, this man's a friend. He was followed by Ananias, trust him, why not us? And this goes back to the language he uses as he continues. I mean, he mentions in verse 14 about God of our ancestors. That goes back to Exodus chapter 3, verses 15, 16. This is how God addressed himself to Moses. And we're getting this summary of Paul's life, and until, starting in verse 16, he calls upon them to act. And in act, he's calling on them to accept Jesus Christ, to be baptized, to wash away their sin. And then, starting at 17 through 21, this isn't his conversion story. This really is more that's happened since, where he's defending himself against the charges that he defiled the temple by bringing a Gentile with him into the temple. And that's not going to be helpful for him, because in verse 18, the minute he mentions Gentiles, mentions his friend, it just sends them into a rage. And this isn't because they don't want Gentiles to come to know God. This is more because really they're rejecting all of this. And part of this does even go into the vision he had in the temple. He's not the first to be called by God through a vision. Isaiah was called through a vision in the temple. But at this point, the crowd wasn't going to buy this. To them, Gentiles could become Jews, but they had to be circumcised first. This constant fight that we've had throughout Acts. And at this point, this is no longer about the criminal charges against Paul. This is a pure emotional event. They want Paul dead. And at this point, Paul is rescued by the Romans. The Roman commander, who didn't know Aramaic, didn't know what Paul was saying, but he saw what was happening. He saw a riot was forming, and he acted. And he quickly intervened to prevent Paul's death. Likely because he was told, like he told, this man is a citizen, save him. And we get some important parts as chapter 22 concludes, that we get a sense of what are marks of Christianity. Revolutionary violence is not part of Christianity. Because Paul's not a revolutionary. These people weren't revolutionaries. They weren't concerned about the political establishment. Here, the political establishment is the one rescuing him. Meanwhile, they want to beat him. And that was more the idea of trying to get the truth out. This is a whole thing when it comes to the idea of, we've seen it recently or in past decades with the question about torture. And there is a heavy debate on where's the line between someone willing to tell you the truth because they're afraid of punishment versus someone trying to just end the punishment. So they thought about scourging Paul just to get him to tell the truth, at which point the tribune asks, "Are you a citizen?" And Paul says, "Yes." And the tribune, Lysias, questions this because he had actually had to buy his citizenship. Paul had it by birth, which is even more important. Because, one, that means he couldn't be beaten. At least not before trial and conviction. And also, it means they had to protect him. And there could be the questions, given that he had it by birth, of the importance of his family. Now, we don't know why Paul had it by birth. Some speculate it was because of the family trade of tent making. That would be very valuable for the Roman military. So maybe that's where it was. But this does something special for us, because this now makes Paul the bridge between the Jewish world and the Roman world, because he is the Roman citizen. He is protected by Rome. But all he is doing, he's doing for Christ. And I will say, truth be told, and this was what Bishop Williman actually pointed out in his commentary, that chapter 22, verse 22, through chapter 23, verse 11, doesn't have a lot of information, but it is just full of confusion, of people trying to make sense of what was actually happening. And really, when chapter 22 lets up, the tribune just goes, send him to the Sanhedrin, because he's realizing this is not a legal question. This is a theological issue that he is not prepared or informed well enough to handle. So, getting into chapter 23, Paul is now standing before the Sanhedrin. And when he addresses them immediately, depending on your translation, it says brethren or brothers. Paul's putting himself on equal footing with them. But immediately, the high priest commanded that he be struck. And this is a violation of the law of Moses. There's a good chance Ananias thought that Paul was a wicked man, the troublemaker, and just wants him gone. We don't know what he has heard and who told him what. And he's immediately rebuked by Paul. And the whitewashed wall is an interesting comment that we need to break down. Under ceremonial law, or ritualistic law in Judaism, an Israelite could not touch a dead body. To do so would be ritualistically unclean, and they would have to go through the whole process. They couldn't attend at anything in the temple. Now, what happens afterwards, because of this, is in the burial practices, we see this with Jesus. You have the tomb. And they specifically say, like for Jesus, it was a tomb in which no one had ever been laid. That tomb was not meant to be the permanent tomb for all eternity. You were kind of put in that tomb until you were bones, and then the bones were interred elsewhere. You weren't there forever like we consider a cemetery today. They just wouldn't have had the space to put everyone in caves. Now, between the bones going out and someone else going in, one of the tasks that was done was that they whitewashed the entire wall. Probably someone who was a Gentile or didn't care about ritualistic cleanliness. So they would whitewash all the walls of the tomb before another body went in. That way no one would touch where previously a dead body had been. It was kind of one of those little detail things. And when Paul calls him a whitewashed wall, he's basically calling him out that your faith is on the outside, it's not on the inside. You have the outward appearance of faith and being clean, but inside you're still dirty. And this is troubling because in Exodus, it's actually a crime to speak ill of the rulers. And really when we look at all this, we see this in verse 5. Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of your rulers of your people. That's where that comes in. He's not wearing his religious garb. The high priest had specific clothing. If he had it on, Paul would know exactly who he is. This also means Paul didn't know who gave the command to strike him. Paul may not have been seeing clearly after being struck. But also, this is towards the end of Paul's journey. Decades have passed. He likely didn't know this Ananias. May not have been the same Ananias as previously. We see through history that it was one of a few family names get passed down. If it was the same Ananias that had given him permission to go to Damascus, Paul would have known him, unless he just changed so much in all those years. But more than likely, it's a different one. But then, as Paul speaks to them, this council is made up of Sadducees and Pharisees. And realistically, Paul starts pitting them against each other because they have theological differences. The Pharisees follow the full law, the full scripture, and believe in resurrection and also angels. The Sadducees only followed the written law and did not believe in the resurrection. And by written law, specifically, it's the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Nothing else did they follow. So if it's not there, they didn't believe it. And by bringing up hope and resurrection on trial, they're butting heads. They're pitting the two sides against each other, and they can't come to a decision. And really, when we look at this, one of the things we can see is Paul is making a pretty solid case on the idea that Christianity is the continuation of Judaism, not completely separate. And in the midst of this, the night afterwards, in verse 11, we see that he has a vision of Christ basically reassuring him and also telling him, you will go to Rome. And Jesus' reassurance to Paul is seen throughout Scripture, from Acts 18, 2 Timothy 4, and Hebrews 13. But this was needed because the Jews were out to kill him. And this is where we start seeing things in verse 12. I mean, they took a vow not to eat or drink until Paul was dead. That gives it a very short amount of time they planned to do this. And the Sanhedrin as a whole were complicit in this. But, again, Rome interferes. I mean, his nephew hears about it and goes to the barracks where Paul is staying and tells Paul, and at this point, doesn't matter what the Jews want, Paul's a citizen. If they would kill Paul, the full military weight of Rome was going to come down on them. That kind of shows how blind by rage and hatred the Sanhedrin were against Paul. At this point, they also knew, we got to get him out of here. And the tribune himself made sure this happens. Now, his name was Claudius Lysias. And he writes a letter to the provincial governor, Felix, about what was going on to bring him up to speed. But then made the plans to get Paul, the 60 miles from Jerusalem, to Caesarea, to the praetorium, which was the residence of the governor. Now, they knew that they were going to have like 40 men. Yeah, look at these numbers. 40 men were going to ambush Paul to kill him, which also meant they were probably going to kill the Romans involved with it too. And at which point, in verse 23, we see how many troops they put there. First, 2 centurions. Those are the commanders of 100 men each. But ultimately, it was literally 200 infantry, 70 horsemen or mounted troops or cavalry, and 200 spearmen. That's 470 people to escort Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea. For basically what is a theological matter. Because the letter that was written to go along was saying, he committed no crime. He's a Roman citizen. They're accusing him of stuff. I don't hear any of this. This is a theological issue. At which point, he's going to Felix. And Felix himself is an interesting character. Because Felix, at this point, had been governor for about 5 years, after previously spending 2 years in Samaria. Felix had been born a slave, but his brother Pallas had been a favorite of Nero, who was able to get Felix his free status and also his governorship. And he became the first Roman slave to become governor. And this does impact his rule, because even though he's known to be a bit ruthless, he had been at the bottom before, and he does know that. Ultimately, he would get recalled to Rome because he failed to control a riot here in Caesarea. But what's also going to impact this is Felix's history of marriages. We don't really have any details of his first marriage. But we know his second marriage was to the granddaughter of Antony and Cleopatra, which is him, kind of shows his political savvy of marrying into, basically, for lack of better saying it, marrying into royalty. But then his third and now current wife is Drusilla, who is the daughter of Herod Agrippa I, who's ruling in Antipatris, 25 miles away from Caesarea. And it's not just for political purposes. Drusilla was a well-known beauty in the ancient world. But that marriage is going to cause him problems. And we see that when we get into chapter 24. Now, because we're having a trial before the governor of what's going on, both sides have to be presented. And Ananias travels there with Tertullus, who was a professional orator. And the first 9 verses, that is them laying their case before Felix. And their general case is that Paul was a troublemaker and a pest. He's linked to the insurrectionists, and Rome can't stand disorder. But also, he's the leader of a Nazarene sect. And they're kind of playing in that Paul is part of this messianic movement. And Rome was very leery of these messianic movements because when it was a false messiah, it caused them a lot of headaches through the chaos and disorder that came from it. And they're also stating again that Paul had defiled the temple. And he had defiled the priest, which is defiling a temple. And they're playing heavily on the fact that the Sadducees, especially the priests and the Sadducees, were really Roman collaborators. And Tertullus is kind of urging Felix to remember who their friends are. I didn't mention this in the last chapter, but talking about Ananias, one of the things that William Barclay calls him is a quisling, which, if you know World War II history, that's a way of saying a collaborator, named after Quisling, who was the Nazi ruler in Norway at the time, collaborating leader in Norway. Calling him a Nazarene leader does harken us back to the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 46. That statement, can anything good come from Nazareth? Nazareth is not a nice place to be from. No one considered anyone good to have ever come from there. But they're also trying to link Paul to all the riots that took place in his ministry. Even though Paul didn't cause a single one, it was the Jews reacting to him. But at this point, Paul gets to speak. In verse 10, the governor nodded at him to speak. And when we look at him, he acknowledges Felix, but doesn't go over the top like Tertullus had done. And he just brings up the simple facts. He had gone to Jerusalem with contributions to the poor of the city, and he was meticulously observing the law while he was arrested. He had caused no riots, and he had only been there 12 days, and that's not enough time to cause one. And he basically says he was arrested because he was proclaiming the resurrection. Paul isn't taking pity on himself. And he also points out the original people who complained about him, the Jews from Asia Minor, those likely Jews from Ephesus, they're nowhere to be seen. The ones who made the complaint aren't there to testify that he did what they claimed that he did. But in his witness about following the law and really giving a public witness to people to come to faith and to basically, how a nice way to say this, to repent and to follow God's law is the problem for Paul with Felix. And it goes back to his marriage. Because his wife, Drusilla, previously was married to Azias, the king of Emesa. And Felix had seduced her to leave her first husband and to marry him. This would have been a violation of the Jewish laws, especially for her. And the sad thing is, there may have been some sympathy for Paul in this case. Otherwise. Because there's no way that, given that there was a church in Caesarea, that Felix had not known who they were, and especially given that Drusilla was Jewish, how devout is up to interpretation. There's no way they hadn't heard all these things, and they may have been open to it. But he's not going to respond well to a message of judgment for sins. But he's also not going to immediately condemn Paul because he's still a citizen. So at this point, when chapter 24 ends, Felix keeps Paul imprisoned in Caesarea for 2 years, mainly to satiate the Jews in Caesarea, because previously Felix had gone too far in backing the Gentiles of the city against them, which led to Jews being killed and their homes being looted. So knowing that they had reported him to the emperor, he's trying to curry a little bit of favor with them. He may have also been hoping that if he keeps Paul in jail long enough, they'll just bribe him to let him go. But that's where we leave him. He's imprisoned as a citizen, meaning he can have visitors, his needs are attended to. He's not chained up in a dungeon. But he cannot go any further. And probably one of the sad parts of this, and this was Tony Merida pointing this out, of the idea that Felix here was cautious, and he may have even been convinced of what Paul said, and convinced of the gospel. But if that's the case, he's also the example of one who hears, who understands, and may accept, but will not repent. So at this point, we leave Paul in jail here in chapter 26. Next week, we finish up our time in Acts with Acts chapters 25 through 28. And as with this week, there's a lot happening, but it's mainly story, not doctrine. So it should be an easier way to wrap up. So as always, if you have questions, you can reach out to me. If you're able to, we still have the 3 groups meeting. Wednesday afternoon out in PA Furnace, Wednesday night on Zoom, and Thursday evening in State College. The information is in the bulletin for those, or you could reach out for that information as well. But I invite you now to delve into the text, delve into the study guides, and bring this message home into your life.